Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this EU blockchain workshop. So I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction and recap about what the observatory is. But first, I would like to really thank the Digital Future Society for hosting us today for this workshop. Thank you very much to you and the team for this collaboration. We are very happy with it. And so before we start, we would like to have the opportunity to have an introduction about the Digital Future Society. Thank you very much, and please welcome Karina on stage.
So first of all, I would like to welcome you to our space. This is the Adventures space we have on the other side of the screens, tech acceleration programs and tech transfer programs. But I would like to tell you just a little bit about us and where we are today. So the Digital Future Society is an initiative by the Mobile World Capital. The Mobile World Capital is a public foundation in Spain based in Barcelona. And the Digital Future Society, as a program, our objective is to set the digital agenda for the next 5 years. We work and connect different stakeholders from the public and private sectors, but also from academia and civil society. And at the end of the day, what we do is to guide them and provide them indications on the digital agenda, what are the main issues that will concern us in the coming 5 years. We're talking about mostly on the issues around the governance and regulation of technology and the impact on society. How we do this? As a program, as an initiative, we have different ways of achieving our objective. We have a think tank. I'm the person responsible for the think tank, and today we have a few people from our team here. And then we also have a laboratory where we take the outcomes of the reports we do, we take them to the lab and try to understand what will be the impact on the ground of what we are proposing, or the outcomes of the findings we achieved with the experts that collaborate with us. We also have Natalie Gostur that is responsible for the lab today with us, if you want to meet her at the end later on. She's sitting at the back. And we also do events throughout the year. So next autumn we'll have a large global summit taking place in Barcelona where we'll talk about all these issues. We don't have a date set yet, but we'll announce very soon. And I hope to see you, some of them, in Barcelona for that event. In terms, just very briefly, in case you'd like to find out more about us on our website at digitalfuturesociety.com. Last year, as a think tank, we work on 11 different reports. Most of them are already published online. We have 4 more that will be published in the coming weeks. We've been working on issues like the impact of emerging technology on the public sector, like ADMS, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and so on, but also on issues like trying to understand which measures are being used by the ecosystem at international level to measure digital inclusion, and what are the things that we are missing with the type of measures we are using. And for that type of work, we collaborate with organizations like the United Nations. This year, 2020, we'll be focusing mostly on future of work, the impact again on the emerging tech, more specifically artificial intelligence and the automated decision-making systems in the public sector and gender issues around that. We'll also be working on the tech and climate urgency. We'll be looking at both at the carbon footprint of technology, but also how AI is helping fighting climate change and understand what's happening at different levels, global level, regional, but also local, and which are the different agents working at each level. And finally, we'll keep working on digital divides and social impact. It's something that we've been doing at the foundation for many years, even before Digital Future Society, and we'll keep working on that. With the lab that we have, we have 3 ways that we work. So we do either international call for solutions, where we kind of present a problem and invite the ecosystem to help us with proposals how they will solve that problem, and then we implement, we either give awards or implement pilots with the winners. We also do collaborative pilots where we design specific projects in the city of Barcelona with different stakeholders from both private and public sector. And sometimes we also provide tools and guidelines on how to implement the different outcomes that we have from the think tank. So as I mentioned, we do regular events throughout the year where we talk about the things we do in the FS. And just to give you an idea who is behind us, we have a private-public managing board that we share with the foundation. So we have 3 levels of government. We actually, Digital Future Society is a program funded by the Ministry of Economy in Spain. So we work with both central government, regional government and the city of Barcelona, but also with Vir of Barcelona and GSMI, this Global Association of Teleoperators. We also have 3 other levels of people, international stakeholders that we engage with. We have a global board, we have an advisory board of national ambassadors, and within the think tank we work with about 20 key partners at the global level, and one of them is Consensus. So, if you want to find out more about what we are doing, there are a few people from the team around. I'll be around all day, so feel free to reach out and ask questions, and I'll give the stage back to Ludovic. Thank you very much. I hope you'll enjoy the venue, the city. If you want any tips, if you are new to the city, come to us. I'm sure we can help you, and enjoy your day. Ludovic.
Thank you so much. We are really glad to collaborate with you as your work and the work we do with the observatory is obviously very linked. So thank you very much again for hosting us today. So I just want to start with a brief introduction about the observatory in Forum, because I see some new faces here today, and that's actually the reason why we travel all across Europe to do those workshops. So the EU Blockchain Observatory in Forum is a project of the European Commission that has been launched 2 years ago now, and it aims mainly at creating a center of expertise around blockchain technology in order to make sure that Europe creates the groundwork in order to promote blockchain projects within the region. And so the way we do and we approach this is by, first of all, creating research papers in collaborations with academic partners. Second, we organize workshops, such as the one that we have today. And finally, the main output of the observatory in Forum are reports that summarize the state of play on a specific topic, and also provide the European Commissions with practical recommendations for its policy making. So it's a very important work for the European Commission. It's part of its strategy. And so Consensus has been appointed by the European Commission 2 years ago in order to run and operate this initiative. So for today, the main outputs of the day will be 2 elements. First of all, there will be a report that will be published after the workshop. This report will summarize all the discussions, and this will be a basis for other material that will be then produced by the observatory. Mainly one final big report, we like to call it the EU Blockchain book, that will be published at the very end of the 2 years of the observatory, and that will provide the European Commission and also any reader, as those reports are obviously public, an understanding of what is happening also in the social impact ecosystem, and the use cases that can be developed. So the second output that will be there for the day is the videos that will come out of this workshop. So everything is filmed today. Be aware. So if anyone is not okay with this, please be aware that if you ask any question, this will be recorded and posted online on our website, which is actually good news because people who cannot travel here today with us will be able to get the inputs from the very interesting discussions that we are going to have. So very briefly, you are mostly aware of the agenda of the day, but I just want to maybe remind you a few things. So what we'll be doing today is really about highlighting what are the main use cases that are currently going in production or that are at very advanced stage. And the reason why we are focusing on this is because you know, all of you in the room, that sometimes blockchain can be used as a buzzword, but we as technologists know that there are inherent benefits of using this technology, and we want to focus on that and the actual benefits and the practical implementations. This is really the focus for today. And there will be also a second type of discussion that is very linked to the objective of the observatory, which is a discussion about what Europe, the EU, can do in order to promote this ecosystem. And this goes through two means. The first one are very practical support that could be provided by the European Commission or member states. So that could go through fundings for projects or research, for example. And there is currently, with the European Commission, a €5 million prize for blockchain projects that have a social impact that is currently ongoing. So this is part of the activity of the European Commission. And then secondly, more at the EU level, the broader level, the legal and regulatory framework. So some of you today will be explaining what you are doing in your projects, and the discussion will be also linked on what could be done by the member states or the EU in order to accelerate your projects and make sure that you have the right ecosystem and the right framework around it in order to succeed. So this was a brief introduction, and without further ado, I would like to welcome on stage Vanessa Grelet, our colleague from the Observatory and from Consensus, in order to give us the first presentation of the day. Thank you very much, and please welcome Vanessa on stage.
Thank you, Ludovic. Hi everyone, I'm excited to be here to share a little bit our experience working with social impact enterprise in the US and across the globe. So my name is Vanessa Grelet. I'm an executive director at Consensus, but I'm also the president of the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. This coalition started almost 3 years ago and now is a formal foundation that helps bring together people that have social impact projects, bring funders together, and also the public sector and foundations. So all working together. We have an annual conference that we host either in New York or in DC, and we also have an online incubator that goes on for 6 weeks, where we have companies that are formed during that incubator. But before we start, I'd love to know who's in the audience and sort of the level of maturity of the knowledge of blockchain, because sometimes you have people who are very knowledgeable in social impact but don't know the technology, or people who are technologists who don't know how to move around the social impact space. So just a quick raise of hands, who is in the audience a technology company or entrepreneur? So half of the audience. And who is here working in social impact or government? The other half, perfect. So really it's to bridge those two worlds and make them understand what we need in order to find solutions to make this world a better place. So, I'm just going to start by giving a brief overview of the situation and how blockchain can help. Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals are top of mind for everyone, and how to get there is a multifaceted, multi-year project, right? Technology is just one side of it. Emerging technology and being willing to experience with emerging tech is really important in order to serve the most vulnerable population. That being said, people are very careful also working with people in distress situation because they're not an experiment, right? They're not something that you just test your technology with. So there's a fine line that people need to walk when they're working on these types of projects, really understanding the situation on the ground and how the technology can solve for that specific situation without sort of changing the local issues that could get worse with implementing new technologies. So just in blockchain, and those who are not very well-versed in the blockchain technology, when you look at when you want to use a blockchain, there are several sort of high potential use cases and several situations where it's good to deploy blockchain technology. The first one is a shared depository. So what happens usually with also UN for example, institutions or large companies, is that you have several databases that you don't reconcile with each other. So if you have this siloed data that you need to leverage to help the population, but you can't reconcile them, using a blockchain might be a good solution because you have access to this data in a permissioned way and the confidentiality of the data is maintained. Then we say multiple writers. It means that you have multiple stakeholders who need to have access to the same information. So think about a situation with refugees, right? You have, and the World Food Program is going to talk about it, you have one agency which identifies the refugees in a specific way, let's say with an iris scan. Then you have another agency who's going to provide them with a specific service, let's say medication and healthcare, and another agency is going to provide them with food. And they all need to have this holistic view of the people they're serving, or else there might be some issues in managing the whole process. The third item is minimal trust. It means that you're in situations where you don't know where the data comes from, or that you can't always trust the other party. Of course, when you're working, across the globe, there are issues around corruption, around tracking funds, tracking the impact of your funds if you're a foundation or a government. And this is all issues that the blockchain could potentially solve. And then if you're in a situation where there's a lot of intermediaries, so let's say banks who take a lot of fees when you're doing remittances, etc., then if you're able to do a direct payment through the blockchain, then it reduces the fees and allocates more power and money to the people actually who are sending money. And a 10% fee is huge when you're sending $100 to your family, right? It's if we can reduce that, that's really exciting. And then transaction dependencies is really when you're dependent on these intermediaries. So this is a general framework. I just wanted to set the stage for that, so that you your day-to-day think about all these issues and how blockchain solutions can help you. So I'm going to give an overview of the basic use cases that we've seen with our members in the coalition, but also working with the UN, etc., where people focus their attention in social impact and blockchain. What are the main solutions that people are looking at? So the first one that emerged with us very clearly was, the first one is identity and vulnerable populations. So the fact that you can identify some specific people who need services, whether it's homeless, whether it's refugees, whether it's other people in distressed situation that are not able to justify of what they're owed, is something that is really a focus. And there's a lot of projects that are trying to create what we call self-sovereign identity in order for people to maintain the record of their credentials. So it can be your identity, it can be, for example, anything related to your work experience, it can be things related to your studies. Usually I don't even know where my diplomas are, so let alone trying to find a copy of them. So if you have this register with your identity where everything, all your accreditation is there, it's easy to deploy after also linking it to financial inclusion, because you can attest of the fact, for example, let's say that you've paid a rent for years, but you didn't have a contract, but you can prove that you've paid these amounts. Think of day workers who receive, like let's say in Bangladesh, they receive an amount in cash every day, and then they have paper receipts. How are they going to justify that they, on a regular basis, actually receive that money and had a regular flow of money and can be creditworthy? So there's a lot of situations where having this record that's accessible by your phone or anywhere in the world would be very easy. The issue is, of course, having government entities or other entities recognize the validity of this. So identity, financial inclusion also includes everything related to cash transfers. I was talking about remittances. This is a key issue. The banks take very high fees. It's very hard in terms of KYC, etc., to have access to financial institutions. Some people want to bank the unbanked. Some people want to unbank the banked. So I think it's just an issue of finding a new solution that is adapted to the populations, not trying to force feed the existing institutions which have left them out, right? Then the third theme is supply chain. So as you've seen, for example, in China, there's a huge, for example, focus right now on food security. There's a huge focus on sustainability. People want to know what they wear. People want to know where their clothes come from. They want to know that their food is organic. And using blockchain solutions is a way to do that. It's not the bulletproof way, but it's one of the ways. We see supply chain solutions in the fishing industry, for example, where there's a lot of human trafficking and forced labor. In the garment industry, same thing. So if you're able to have more transparent supply chain and have everyone see in real time what's happening in the supply chain, there is less room for abuse in those supply chains. And then the fourth one is energy and environment. Even though my country decided to leave the Paris Accords, it is a huge focus of our world. If we don't have a planet, we can deploy whatever technology, it's not going to serve us well. So, the capacity of the blockchain to create records around carbon footprint, carbon offset, create new possibilities in terms of managing electricity, peer-to-peer trading, and renewable energy management is really a huge opportunity. So we see some projects in that space, including one called Nori, which graduated from our incubator. So just a shout out to them. So those are the 4 use cases that we've seen that were prominent and top of mind for everyone. But then we saw some really interesting other use cases, which I find really exciting, around human rights, democracy, philanthropy, education. And on the human rights side, think about human rights activists. What do they need? They need security about themselves. They need security around their information. They need their funding to be secured and not have the government or other parties intervene. So there are ways for them to use blockchain-based cryptocurrencies and solutions that allow for that, that is sort of tamper-proofed. In the democracy side of things, we see a lot of things around direct democracy and voting and how to manage fake news, trying to get a register around fake news, trying to get procedures of voting that are more secure than existing procedures, whether it's in developed countries or developing country. And this idea of liquid democracy, where we can get a more granular way of understanding what people want. So, for example, there's a company called Democracy Earth, and they were very active during the peace process in Latin America, where there were some people who were outside Colombia who could not vote on the peace process. They were barred from voting, and so they organized this voting online on the blockchain to ask them what their opinion was about the peace process. And they didn't ask them yes or no for the peace process, they asked them for several questions, which gave a really subtle understanding of what people wanted and what they were bothered with in the peace process. So I think that's really something that governments, local governments can think about and can use very easily. Then moving on to philanthropy, I think it's philanthropy and also for governments, it's really this idea that sometimes you don't know what happens to the funds that you donate. You don't know how the funds are used. You don't know if they're used to, used in corruption for third parties, etc. And there is a lot of very large institutions, multilateral institutions, which are looking at this because when they receive donations from countries and then they deploy them to projects, sometimes a little bit of money gets lost in the process. And so there's this idea that if we are able to create a track and trace of all the funds with the receipts, with the contracts of how the funds are deployed, the projects, and trying to measure the impact of that, that would be a very exciting way to deploy blockchain solutions. We see things around donations in crypto, also how to use creatively crypto. And then finally, education, as I mentioned before, with the identity, the records, this idea that our workplace is going to change dramatically in the coming years, right? With technology, we're going to be working more. We're going to have continued education. We're going to have to justify our skills. And so if you have this lifelong record of what you've done, what you've achieved, people can give you attestations, and verified attestations about this, I think it allows to build up your profile in the workspace. And I think that will be needed because we're going to have, people used to work 20 years in a company, now we're going to work 3 times 20 years in a company, maybe. So, except in France, where I come from. And I decided not to do that. So, these are the principal themes. I just want to do a time check in terms of, okay, good. Because I have some examples for you, and I also want to share what I think is needed in order for these types of solutions to succeed, right? And we're really at a turning point right now. So we did some case studies, we worked with the UN, we did some case studies around how blockchain projects are deployed around the SDGs. So there's a lot of them. This was done last year, so we need to refresh it. But basically, there's a lot of projects that are aligned with the SDGs. You will notice that SDG number 5, which is women, we didn't find any project that was deploying blockchain solutions, but I'm still hopeful. So what's interesting about this is that contrary to other, the way that the blockchain industry, matured is not the same way that the blockchain for social impact projects mature, because they started very early. Blockchain is a promise that inspired a lot of people to create a fairer and more distributed world where everyone has opportunities. And so very early, people understood that and created some projects. And so when we looked at all the projects, we did a study of these projects, we looked at the maturity, where they stand. They've been in existence almost for 2 years now. Some of them, a lot of them are live. The issue, and you see they're distributed around all types of issues. And I don't have another slide, but they're also very distributed globally, which is really interesting compared to the Web 2 developments, which were really just San Francisco. And what's really exciting is that we're reaching a level of maturity where they're in production, right? It's not just POCs, it's things that since the technology is now mature enough, you can really deploy the things. The only thing that is missing is a few issues to support it. So there are some issues around regulation. So that is something where still a lot of big actors who are not comfortable with crypto and blockchain, associated with either Bitcoin, money laundering, or the ICO craze, which has damaged a lot the industry. But now we're in a state of maturity where we don't have those excesses anymore, and people need to feel comfortable with the legal standing of blockchain. And so Europe has been moving along and passing on legislations to cater for this. The US is still a bit more rigid in terms of funding. But I think it would be great to dig a little bit deeper and have specific legal status for digital assets that allows you to move in the space comfortably. The other thing that is really important is the funding. So what's happening now in the blockchain industry is that we had all the funding that came through the ICO, which was crowdsourced, and now the funding comes from VCs. And a lot of VCs in the US require very high return rates and multiples, and also demand that the projects deliver very quickly their results and scale. And the issue when you work with vulnerable populations, when you work in developing countries, is that it's just, you need more time, right? And so you do need more patient capital that understands the possibilities of the projects and what they can deliver and the social impact that they can deliver. And I think here, the governments, investors can do several things. First, we can create dedicated funding vehicles and accelerators for this. So the European Union has a $100 million fund that is dedicated to blockchain and AI, and then it has a social impact fund. But none of these actually deal with this type of companies, right? So it would be fantastic to have a little bit like the contest that we have with the $5 million prize, to have a dedicated vehicle for that, or accelerators, because what is really missing for the entrepreneurs in the space is understanding how they can scale and having contacts with the local communities or large companies that can help them scale. So accelerators, funding vehicles are desperately needed for the space. And also in order to work better with governments. Then the second point is bridging education and IT resources gap. So usually that happens in the government. So we focus a lot on education. For example, right now we're working with a few countries in Latin America where we train the existing IT civil servants and IT teams in government. But this is, you know, the chase for talent in the space for blockchain is really difficult, and usually if you don't have a dedicated team or IT team that understands the tech, then there will be pushback. So it's also internal transformation of the people who use the services. Then tax incentives would be a very exciting way to incentivize people to invest in the space, especially VCs. We've seen that with the VC industry. Why not do it for social impact? And then increase the role of governments. I think governments have huge opportunities to really change the way they engage with citizens with blockchain, whether it's distribution of social security, benefits, whether it's dealing with homeless population. There is tons of things where the blockchain can be really a great tool. But they really need to take that leap of faith and be more engaged. So for example, in the US, we're working with the city of Austin on a homeless project. And there was also a previous project with homeless where people get a phone, they get an ID, they get a wallet, and then they have access to all their services through that. So this is just, you know, one example of how that can work. So those are really my my recommendation based on the, you know, what I've seen in the space. Any questions at this stage? Yeah.
Out of all the project, oh sorry, microphone.
Yeah, sure. So we are recording, so.
1, 2. Yeah, just out of all the projects you've shown, like on the SDG, which one, talking about traction, talking about like, you know, making the leap between starting and building the technological base to actually having people using it. Which one here is the one you would say is the most used?
Yeah, so we have, if you look at SDG 7, we have a company called Grid Plus, and full disclosure, this was a consensus project that allows people to manage the electricity and do peer-to-peer exchanges, etc. And this is getting traction with customers. Viance, the other one on the SDG 12, is a track and trace process where we did a track and trace, for example, of red tuna, working with the World Wildlife Fund. So from fish to plate, from bait to plate, sorry, you could track the red tuna all the way to the consumer. So these projects are really getting traction. I2I, the SDG 1, was a financial inclusion projects working with a lot of banks in Philippines. So I would say trying to get to the end consumer is difficult. You have to have the right UX, UI, and this is something that the blockchain developers were not very good at. We're getting better. So I think it's about scaling. It's about getting the consumer into this sphere.
So thanks a lot, Vanessa, for this presentation. I have a question because I heard so far, I mean, the solutions you present sound wonderful, but what do you do if there are errors in the system and the system doesn't work? I mean, like, for instance, if you use blockchain for land registries, but you do it in a country where, well, these registries don't work well. So, I mean, blockchain is wonderful, but what if the, first system base doesn't work? So how do you deal with these barriers?
So the land registry example is really interesting because have you seen any land registries projects that are going live? Yeah, but in developing countries? No. So we've been talking with the World Bank about this, and it's an issue because there's so much uncertainty, political uncertainty, there's no trust in the government, there is no trust in any public records, and the blockchain is not going to solve for that. So, however, if so in this situation, you're dependent on the government to do something, unless you try to experiment with a very local government, let's say one city, where you have buy-in from the people there, and then the question remains of how is the legal validity of what is attested in the blockchain done. But one of the PwC executives, former PwC executives who was originally from India, told me that his house in India was sold 3 times when they were on vacation. So so you could see where it's possible, but the garbage, what we call the garbage in, garbage out, in terms of the data, is as good as the data that you put in. So agree there are some really real challenges around that. Yes, so I'll finish my presentation with a few examples of how we work in really different contexts. So LACchain is a coalition of a lot of actors in Latin America. We created LACchain with the American Inter-Development Bank, IADB, and especially IADB Labs, who wanted to create a settlement layer based on blockchain for Latin America, where everyone could plug in projects, etc. So we've been working with them, creating this interoperable public permission network based on Ethereum, and then the possibility to create self-sovereign identities, and then have tokenized fiat money that is transferred across Latin America. So this is one of the examples, and the IADB has been super active, of how multilateral organizations, governments, and private sector can work together, deploying something in a region that everyone can use. So it's almost like a public utility that people can create blockchain-based projects on. So that's one example, and we also have partners like Alastria and other institutions that are based in Latin America. The other example is one platform that we have called Impactio that allows you to fund some projects. So we worked with the World Wildlife Fund to create this. So think of it as a the capability to incentivize people to fund some specific impact and philanthropic projects. So that's another example, and that's a global example too. Project I2I, which I mentioned before, is a financial inclusion project. So what happens in the Philippines is that you have a lot of rural banks which are not linked to central banks and larger banks in the Philippines through SWIFT. So it takes a lot of time to move money around, and the delays of this impact the clients of the rural bank, who have to wait up to 3 weeks to get money from people outside the country or things like that. So the way that we created this project, and it's still going on, is that we linked all the banks to a blockchain platform, which allows to recognize and reconcile the assets much quicker. The third example I want to give is, and I'm giving you examples which are a little bit out of the box, which I think are interesting because they're not the usual use cases where you think you could use blockchain. So the State Department gave us a grant to work with Levi's and Harvard around workers' rights. So what happens in the factories is that there is sometimes worker abuse, or the conditions under which the workers work are not always optimum. And Levi's, the headquarters, is of course very concerned about this and wants to make sure that all the workers are treated fairly. And so each year they take this how do you call it, a self-reporting test where they attest of their work conditions. But the issue is that locally sometimes there's pressure of people who are running the factories, which are the ones who commit the abuse. And so people don't want to speak, they don't want to fill out the surveys, they think that people will have access to their responses and that they will get that it will backfire on them. And so the idea is to create a survey based on the blockchain so that people don't have access, local people don't have access to them, and the results go directly to the company head. And so we worked on the ground in Mexico, with the factories, trying to really understand the process, trying to understand what were the needs of the workers when they filled out this survey. And some people were illiterate, how do they answer the survey, etc. So there's a lot of things going into this, and hopefully the conclusion in a couple of years is that the results that come out of this new form of survey are more transparent and more accurate, rather than just ticking a box on the results. And then I'll finish with this great example of financial inclusion, and I think it's a lesson learned for everyone. We worked with Sampo and Oxfam on this project called Vanuatu Unblocked Cash. Vanuatu is prone to a lot of natural disasters, and so there's a lot of aid that goes into and is given directly to the populations. And the way that we created this new way of dispensing the aid is that we worked with the local population maintaining their habits. So we wanted to create an experience where we would use blockchain-based and crypto, but the local population would see a difference in their experience. But it would be much cheaper, much faster. They could get onboarded super quickly on the app. And so that was a project that was done last year. It's a pilot that is continuing and that is scaling up. And I think a lot of the foundations, NGOs, etc., are trying to figure out how to reach the last mile. How can people who barely just have access to a phone can actually leverage all these functionalities in a way that they're comfortable and they're going to use, because it's great to have the technology available. If people don't use it, it's not going to serve anyone. So I think that was an example of a very successful pilot in that space. I think I am now done, but I'm happy to take more questions and continue the conversation after.
Thank you.